70% of our economy starts to go away and companies start laying people off, that's when we may be in trouble.
AI is here to stay, and it's here to take our jobs away.
The dollar store said that nowadays the majority of their customers make 6 figures or more a year, and our age of a first-time home buyer is now 40. And in 2019, it was 33.
Wow, what a difference.
It's one of the trends, the divergence of what we call a K-shaped economy. Their stocks have gone up in the last few years, and so they have a wealth effect. Tariffs are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. We're still in the thick of
it. Welcome to the Money Signal podcast, from Main Street to Wall Street. Today, I am joined by Erin McLaughlin for a very interesting conversation around consumers, which, as many of you know, is a passion of mine. I am honored to have you on our podcast, Erin.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the consumer conversations and statistics, which I love, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure, absolutely. I'm Erin McLaughlin, and I work here in New York City at the Conference Board. We are very well known for our Consumer Confidence Index, and I am one of the senior economists there. I don't work directly in the statistics on the index, but I translate it, for the media, for our members who are usually Fortune 500 companies and other institutions, and also in the media. And so, we'll be talking about that today. My background is actually, previous to the Conference Board, was deep in infrastructure and commercial real estate.
Oh.
So that's why I thought it might also be interesting for us to talk a little bit today about how consumers interact with the built environment. And that might be interesting too.
I love that. Welcome. Pleasure to have another data strategist on the podcast and talk some statistics and geek out a little bit. So for context for our audience, you analyze economic data points and you analyze consumers.
Yes.
And how they impact the economy.
Yes.
I analyze the consumer sentiment and consumer conversations on social media and how they impact brands or how they impact general trends from marketing perspective. So today I was thinking, why don't we actually start with the latest consumer report that just came out?
Right.
Would you like to break this down for us?
I would. So we produce the Consumer Confidence Index on a monthly basis, and it's very interesting to see how it moves every month. And we ask a set of consumers how they feel about not just purchasing goods, but also purchasing services, how they feel about the labor market, and how they feel about sort of the general business environment. So it sort of goes a little bit beyond just, what they plan to buy. What we've seen is really what us economists call range-bound activity, which is fairly negative. So, when a news point comes out that sort of goes down, we often see a little bit of a dip. Sometimes if folks are feeling a little better, it swings up a little bit. And it came up a tiny bit. It came up 0.8. So in March, it was 91.8. But generally, we're still sort of in negative territory. And that's generally because consumers have been feeling pressure from tariffs over the last year. They're seeing a stable labor market, but they're sensing, because of a lot of the geopolitical uncertainty, now we're sort of beyond tariffs into the war with Iran and inflation being persistent, that things maybe are not fantastic, but they're resilient. Consumers have still been spending.
The U.S. consumer is indeed very resilient. How is the study done? Is it survey-based?
It is survey-based, yes.
What's the sample size?
The sample size is around 1,000, and it's very interesting because we also have them write in comments.
Okay.
And so sometimes that's where consumers reveal themselves. And it's interesting to see tariffs were a big part of the comments before, and now gasoline prices and the effect of the war in Iran, which covered certainly some of the survey period in March, were part of the comments as well.
That's fascinating to hear. And I'd love to read to you some of my statistics.
Of course.
From the
Yes.
social media end. And I'd love for you to weigh in from your point of view.
Okay.
So you just mentioned tariffs as one of the big things that has been bothering the U.S. consumer. What I've seen in the data set over the last over 12 months now that I've analyzed is that is actually true. The top concerns for the U.S. consumer in the last 12 months have been tariffs and inflation.
Okay. Yep.
So in the last 30 days, mirroring your report, because I mirrored the dates, the U.S. consumer on social media has talked about tariffs with over 9 million mentions.
Oh, wow.
English language only. So if you put that in the perspective of obviously, say, I don't know, the census is, I believe, 330 million population at the moment. With comprising of 172 million households or something close to that. So we have 9 million just in 30 days talk about tariffs. And the data signals, because we love talking about signals here, is that actually negative sentiment rose by 20% month over month.
Wow.
So it's a prior month.
Okay.
So in your report, what specifically did you see that consumers pointed out when it came to tariffs?
When it comes to tariffs. So it's interesting because we really see it comes down to sort of what I would call like optional spending, you know, when it comes to if you're going to buy a television, if you're going to buy a new car, if you're, you know, obviously some of those things are, everybody needs a car to get to work, for example, but perhaps you're going to trade down. You're going to buy a used car instead of a new car. And so I think that that's where the sort of the purchase of goods versus services is where we've seen a lot of the mention and the concern around tariffs. I think what's really fascinating from sort of from our point of view, from sort of a Wall Street or macroeconomic perspective, is that everybody thought that tariffs were going to sort of enter the inflation and the cost of goods earlier because we had, you know, we're just right around Liberation Day, the 1 year anniversary of Liberation Day. But we didn't really see tariffs fully implemented and baked in until much later. And even now, a lot of companies are not passing them on. So at the Conference Board, we forecast that this first half of 2026 is when consumers are really going to see the price increases from tariffs.
Very interesting. Does that have to do anything with the current trade conversations too?
Yes.
In the sense of, obviously, you mentioned the war and we have...
Right. I think some of it is that companies know that their consumer bases are sort of exhausted from inflation. They were exhausted from the inflation that occurred after COVID. They're really cognizant of prices, especially for things that they buy all the time, like groceries, pet supplies, those kinds of things. And so they're hesitant to pass the tariffs along if they thought, well, maybe they won't stick. And then we saw that Supreme Court decision come out and say that the IEEPA tariffs, you know, were not held up. But the administration came out and said, okay, well, you know what? We found this other sort of rule that we can put tariffs on for 5 months, aka 150 days, while we do a study, different kinds of studies, and then we'll have tariffs that are based on what are called Section 232 and 301, which essentially means tariffs related to national security and unfair trade practices. And those have generally stood up over time. And so tariffs are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. And so that's in part why I think that, you know, we're still in the thick of it. We're still sort of at the peak of that one-time quote unquote hit.
Very interesting. What about services? So cost of goods obviously is impacted by tariffs and obviously other things. But when it comes to services, what are those things that consumers in the U.S. complained about?
Well, it's interesting because even, you know, 10 years ago or before, services didn't make up such a big part of our economic activity. And then, of course, we had COVID, where folks couldn't spend on services the way they did before. They were spending on goods, and that created a demand shock, and it created goods being a lot more expensive. But folks really love to spend on services that are experiential. And I'm sure that you've studied that as well. So that's where travel, eating out, perhaps getting food delivered, and things that basically, and then sort of services related to health and beauty and wellness. And so we see consumers still really prioritizing that. In fact, eating out, getting food delivered, not necessarily cooking food at home, but doing that is still the number one service category that we see consumers saying that they plan to spend money on, which I think is really interesting because that's an easy way to cut back during hard financial times.
Right.
And I don't think the consumer's ready to cut back there yet. They like to go to restaurants and they like their food delivery.
Ease of convenience.
Yes.
Very important. And comfort actually is something very important. As a mom, I can tell you that, yes, getting my food delivered is definitely one of the higher priorities. I'm wondering, what does that mean? What does it tell you from an economic perspective? So I keep on hearing my co-host, Peter Tuchman, the Einstein on Wall Street, always talks about the economy, the market, how it's performing and how it's affecting the broader economy in the U.S. When you look at the report, the consumer report, what does it really tell you in terms of where's the economy headed? Do you feel like outside of tariffs and obviously the consumer being more pressured in Q1 of 2026, do you see like some kind of silver lining in all of it for consumers and the consumers actually spending more and helping the economy? Or where do you see that?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that even if consumers feel a little negative, like your data shows, like our survey shows, they will continue to spend. Mm-hmm. But when they feel that the job market is really weakening, or they feel that they will lose a job, or they're sensing that people in their industry or their families, their friends are losing jobs, then they tighten up. So you can have negative feelings, but still be spending. Mm-hmm. But when you think that your income, is going to go away, that changes folks' perspective. And what we've seen is that even though the labor market is weakening over the last few months and really few quarters, we haven't seen the unemployment rate go up. So the unemployment rate is still at about 4.4%. And, we have some demographic challenges because we have a very large population retiring with the baby boomer population. And we have policies that are, really reducing or really almost eliminating immigration, and our foreign-born workforce is getting smaller. And so even though there may be a mismatch between available jobs and available talent, we're still seeing a very stable labor market. But it's what economists call low hire, low fire, meaning it's stable, but we're not really adding a lot of jobs. And so that is making a lot of sort of Wall Street and other people a little bit nervous, because if we're not adding jobs and we go through a weakening of the economy and consumer spending, which is 70% of our economy, starts to go away and companies start laying people off, that's when we may be in trouble. And so that's sort of a big part of what we look at, even though it's sort of in the background, that labor market component to the consumer confidence index and really to what's happening in the macro economy is a big part of that.
And does the consumer confidence index report study consumer sentiment and how that shifts? Do you guys also look at that?
We do, and we ask the survey participants about their impressions of the labor market and of business conditions to see how that moves. And it's been fairly steady, but fairly negative, unfortunately, even though the spending is still pretty strong.
And what has been that negative sentiment driver? What have you seen anything specific that comes out?
It really is about public policy. We're at a time where tariffs, geopolitics, going to war, Washington is driving the economic conversation. And Washington, in part, may drive, how consumers spend. Now, one thing that I think will be interesting to see in the next couple months is oftentimes around this time of year, we see a little bit of the consumer perking up because they get tax refund checks. And so, and there's different statistics around that. So I'll be curious to see, we do have some pressure on gasoline prices and some other products, but it will be interesting to see if we see any sort of perkiness happen over the next couple months because people are getting some tax refunds.
Right. Next month, I'm sure will be maybe a different story.
Maybe.
When you mentioned the job market as something that the Consumer Confidence Index also measures, and it's interesting for me to hear that there isn't so much worry around that based on the consumer findings, at least from this month. So one of the things that I've seen on social media when I've analyzed general consumer sentiment around employment has been AI.
Oh, yes.
That has been coming up over and over again, pretty much in every single analysis that I've done. And there's this big consumer fear that we see on social media among the US consumer that AI is here to stay and it's here to take our jobs away. What do you say to the consumer, who is listening right now? Like, how should they think about, the jobs
AI.
And AI?
I mean, it is really a big unknown for all of us, right? When you think about, will AI be a tool, that sort of improves all of our lives potentially, makes us more productive, makes us more efficient, or is AI going to become an economist and write my reports? I mean, I don't know that an AI person can go on a podcast or an AI bot couldn't go on a podcast, but when each one of us probably thinks about our jobs and thinks about AI, there's part of our jobs, that AI could do. And so I think that there is probably reasonable concern all over the board. I mean, AI is not going to deliver an Amazon package to your front door, but it could probably improve the process of getting an Amazon package to your front door. So, I think we're in the early stages of really understanding what is going to happen. And we see that even, with regards to data centers and infrastructure around AI and around sort of big technology. So I think we're in the early stages. I can definitely understand why folks online and would have concerns because it is a great unknown. It's the next industrial revolution in many ways.
I'm sure we'll follow to see.
Yeah.
So besides goods and services, what else does the Consumer Confidence Index measure?
Well, we do also measure things somewhat related to age, which I'm curious to know, what your data that you're measuring from social media also shows. So recently, in our most recent Consumer Confidence Index, older folks, felt more negativity compared to younger folks. Oh. And sometimes it changes a little bit, and it's not a dramatic difference. But I was wondering and looking at that if older folks were perhaps responding to the hit to the stock market in the last month or so, because we really do see in many ways, the economy showing up differently for wealthier, who are often older consumers, versus younger consumers who are still getting their footing. One sort of good example of how this is showing up in the economy is, I also focus, as I was saying, on infrastructure, the built environment, commercial real estate, and housing. And our age of a first-time home buyer is now 40. And in 2019, it was 33.
Wow, what a difference.
It's a huge difference. And a lot of that is because, we have a lack of supply of housing in the US, but we also have a housing that is a lot more expensive. In some markets, housing prices have doubled since 2019. So, and we had low interest rates, and now we have higher interest rates, which are probably closer to normal and what they will be. And so that's really interesting because a lot of life, I jokingly always say, a lot of life is lived in your 30s, right? And the difference between 33 and 40, if you're getting married, having children, adding to your family, is big. But it's also, and we know this from talking to our members, purchasing a house also drives a lot of consumer activity. Because often when folks purchase a house, they purchase furniture, they purchase appliances, they might purchase a second car. And we even learned from some of our corporate members, they also get pets. And they may have, because they have a bigger house, they might be able to add to their furry family. And so owning a house, or the process of buying a house or buying a new house, also drives a lot of consumer activity. So having sort of this quiet housing market that's not sort of churning over like it used to, and that we're not adding residential, has really meant that that's also probably dampening a little bit of consumer activity that we would have seen before.
Well, that may be the fact now, but when we look at the audience of Gen Z and the demographics of Gen Z, while they are not preoccupied with buying a home, because obviously they're too young yet, they love going to shopping malls.
Yes.
So real estate for shopping malls,
Right.
surprisingly, has actually changed dramatically over the last couple of years. I'd love to hear more of, you had shared with me a very interesting statistics about that. I'd love for you to share with our audience as well.
I think one of the things that's really interesting now, I'm a little bit older, so I was a teenager in the 1990s, and that's what we went to the mall, because that's how you would see your friends, right? I mean, you see them in school or maybe activities, but we didn't interact on social media because social media didn't exist. So if you wanted to see your friends, you'd go to the food court, you'd go see a movie, you'd walk around the mall, or, especially because a lot of towns don't have quote unquote downtowns, like they used to. So I was really fascinated, and, following commercial real estate, we've had sort of the decline of the US mall now for really 10 or 15 years. And that's largely due to online shopping, replacing a lot of that purchasing activity. So I thought it was amazing to see that young folks are like, let's get to the mall. But not only that, they're going to the mall and they're taking pictures and like putting them on TikTok or Instagram or what have you to show that they were at the mall. And, it's really interesting in the sort of economic world or in the commercial real estate world, the discussion is not just like, okay, malls are back, but it's like, what is going to make a mall attractive? Right? So malls have some of the malls that have saved themselves in the last few years have done it by attracting luxury consumers, right? Like back in the day, a mall, you could anchor it, with a Macy's or a Bloomingdale's and get a lot of folks to the mall. But nowadays, sort of a lot of people shop at different stores. They're not necessarily interested in those big anchor stores in the same way. And so some malls have survived by sort of catering to that top quartile of shopper. But the conversation is really interesting, and I'm curious to hear what you're hearing from social media in the last, 6 or 12 months about how young people, feel they've rediscovered the mall. And so that's not your top quartile of shoppers necessarily. So, developers are thinking, okay, do I need to put up backgrounds and interesting things or public art for like Instagram photo type opportunities?
Right.
Do I need to have like food or other sort of experiential things that speak to younger folks or social media presence?
And those are the future consumers who will be giving us the survey responses. So the top 3 things that I've seen among Gen Z consumers in the U.S. and why they go to the mall, because we analyzed that data, was to buy beauty products. That was the top category, actually, with some of the big, large retailers like Sephora among those mentioned, Blue Mercury and a few of the others. The secondary one was actually apparel, which makes sense.
Yes.
And then the tertiary, or the third one, was entertainment, so moviegoers. So there does seem to be a lot of that resurgence among the Gen Z consumers who are fueling our economy and making it stronger, that they are very interested in going back to the mall to shop.
Right.
When we think of, I love going back to the point of the economy and like, again, where's the economy headed? Like, what are those things that impact us? From like the 1, 2, 3s of, whoa, this is scary coming up, to, maybe this is just normal at this point. What are those like things that you think are really impacting the economy right now? We talked about tariffs.
Yes.
We talked about the global trade war, which comes with tariffs and the tariff territory. We are talking wars. There's multiple wars going on right now. Are those really the key drivers of the economy? Or what else is out there that could impact where the next 12 months will head into?
That's a great question. So we forecast, we do a forecast, and we try to look ahead. Really, we try to look ahead 5 years, but it's very hard to look that far ahead. But we definitely are looking ahead, at least 1 year. We measure economic activity, of course, through GDP and forecasting GDP. We do think that we will have a slower economy this year than we did last year and certainly the year before. We do not think that we're going to enter into a recession, although the longer something like the Iran war happens and the higher we see gasoline prices go, the greater likelihood that we would enter a recession. But a lot of that is about duration. And no one really has a strong sense of what the duration of this geopolitical conflict will be. But if it doesn't last super long, then it probably will not cause a recession. And there's no real technical definition of a recession, but most people accept, to geek out, the NBER's definition, which is 2 quarters of negative growth that are really not just about one shock. So most likely we're not going to enter a recession, but we are going to have a slower economy. And I think a lot of that does come down to just general uncertainty, just hitting back on the topics that we've already even discussed: tariffs, geopolitical uncertainty around AI. So all of that uncertainty will just could potentially contribute to, a malaise for U.S. consumers who decide, I'm going to rein in my spending a little bit. But again, that's a slowdown, not necessarily a recession.
In terms of consumers who actually follow some of the consumer reports, there are several reports. Obviously, Consumer Confidence Index is one. We have the CPI report. There's like different versions of the consumer report.
Yes.
What would you say basically when you collect these consumers for the survey? Like, what's the one thing that you look for in the consumers who actually answer and respond for the Consumer Confidence Index specifically?
For the Consumer Confidence Index specifically, we look at changes. So, which is kind of, I think, probably pretty typical of a survey. So we're really looking at how the change in the answer, on a month-over-month basis, year-over-year. And that's why, we produce lots of charts and data and graphs, that show. And it's really up oftentimes to, leaders of corporation, those in the business community, to probably decide some strategy based on consumers. I think that one of the trends that we were talking about earlier that we've seen is sort of the divergence of what we call a K-shaped economy. So where we've had a lot of folks who are probably in the top, quartile or top 10% of earners, and they feel good, their feelings about the economy are good because their stocks have gone up in the last few years. As we were saying, the price of housing and their equity in their houses have gone up. And so they have a wealth effect, where they feel wealthier, and so they feel more confident spending. And the bottom third of sort of earners, folks sort of on the economic spectrum, might feel things tighter. And so that's another thing to sort of keep an eye on. And I think for a lot of decision makers, both policymakers and corporate leaders, to keep an eye on, because some folks have said that a lot of our growth in our economy is really just coming from the top 10%. Mm-hmm. And that can be kind of tough because that's a small audience. That does not necessarily show like a broad and strong economy if you're really only catering to the top 10%. So as we see some of these shocks, like the shock in gasoline prices, or any other shocks like we could see with health insurance prices, that shock will affect folks at the bottom of earning and economic spending more than at the top. And so if they have to change their spending habits, that's where we'll see things sort of show up. One statistic that I saw was that the dollar store said that nowadays the majority of their customers make six figures or more a year.
Oh, wow.
Which isn't necessarily what people thought before. And that even Walmart and some stores that, a lot of folks think cater to lower income or middle income folks are seeing a lot of higher income folks come in and purchase things because they want the value. They want bang for their buck. And so being able to sort of target certain demographics and understand their feelings about the economy are important.
Very important. One of the statistics brings back some data statistics that I've analyzed was actually that the consumer is very value driven. We've seen it over and over again. Anytime I've analyzed retail conversations, I consistently have seen in those last 12 months that consumers are value driven. They're moving and shifting away from luxury retailers to the everyday retailers such as Walmart, such as Target, TJ Maxx. Yes. Obviously, we've seen it also in the print on Wall Street with some of the very successful earnings for companies like Walmart. And it's interesting that you also mentioned healthcare. So another topic I've also seen is that healthcare premiums and insurance conversations have spiked.
Wow.
Ever since the tariff announcement happened, because consumers have come out with a lot of concern regarding medical cost, regarding medication cost, and also regarding anything that has steel in it.
So steel and aluminum.
Steel and aluminum, which goes into a lot of the
a lot of packaging too.
Right, medical devices that are made out of it. So it's interesting that you mentioned, because again, the U.S. consumer is pressured from every single angle. Now, another thing that you also mentioned is that the baby boomers are retiring.
Yes.
Boy, should I be concerned about that? What happens when they retire? I mean, aren't they like our worker force at the moment? I'm kidding.
Well, it is interesting because we do see that change in labor market.
Right.
So I believe the youngest baby boomers maybe are in their 60s now. And so most of them will be retired. And then the generation after, my generation, Generation X, is much smaller than the generations afterwards. So, folks in retirement, as long as the stock market, is still fairly strong, fairly resilient, they're still going to spend money, probably. They'll spend it differently. But definitely healthcare spending takes up more and more, of folks' budgets, and we see that in pharmaceuticals, as you were saying, and we also see that just in care. And so one thing that I think is really interesting to look at is not just health insurance, but also property insurance has really gone up in the last few years. And so these are must-haves. You have to have generally health insurance. If you have a mortgage on your house, you have to have property insurance. You have to have automobile insurance. And so as these sort of required costs go up, we see that consumers might have to rein in some of their, more fun optional spending, or like you were saying, look for value. Maybe instead of going to a more expensive supermarket, they go to Walmart. And I believe Walmart, besides being, non-perishable goods, I think is the country's largest grocery store as well. So I think that's where we see, I don't even want to call it trading down, but sort of more value purchases happening.
Absolutely. Erin, thank you so much for the fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me. This has been really interesting.
I appreciate all the knowledge that you shared and the Consumer Confidence Index. I feel more educated, and I'm excited to see what the next couple of months look for the U.S. consumer.
It's not going to be boring, I don't think.
I don't think so either. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
To all of our viewers and listeners, make sure you follow the Money Signal podcast from Main Street to Wall Street. Our official website is moneysignalpodcast.com, and our official social media pages are moneysignal.podcast. Stay tuned for more. See you soon.